Today we will talk about a very sensitive topic: climate change, climate warming. There are a lot of experts in this field, in the field of climate change. But these experts do not have the knowledge that we have. Ice ages were caused by crustal deformations, and that changes the whole perception on the topic of climate change. Almost everything that is said and written about climate change is not true. For example, CO2 does not cause climate change on the long term. CO2 follows climate change. It does not cause climate change. I show you here a graph of climate change over the last 450,000 years. And that is a long time. You see ups and downs, ups and downs, ups and downs. This is what climate experts have called ice ages. They call it, in fact, glaciation cycles. But we call it ice ages. So a dip in the graph is an ice age, and a top in the graph is not an ice age or a warm age. So we go to the right of the graph at the zero, and you see we live in a warm age, not in an ice age, but in a warm age. We are happy people to be in a warm age and not in an ice age. The interesting question that I asked myself and answered for myself, and I want to share this with you, is how much will the climate warm based upon this historical temperature record? Interesting to note is you see here this yellow marked curve in the graph. This curve is the eccentricity of Earth's orbit around the Sun. If eccentricity becomes higher, the curve is higher up in the graph, and when eccentricity is low, the curve is low in the graph. And that is also something that climate experts have not noticed, is there is a correlation between high eccentricity, high temperature, low eccentricity, low temperature, and so on. And there is an interesting period between 200,000 and 215,000 years in the middle of the graph, when eccentricity was exceedingly high. There were two peaks. The experts would say, oh, that was an ice age. No, we know that the upward flanks in the graph are recuperation phases of the biosphere. And it sounds difficult. I will explain this later on in the video. So we go to the right graph and we come at today. We see eccentricity is peaking again. So it is again going to, let's say, an ice age. But how much will the temperature still rise based on this graph? I did the math for you, and that is very interesting what I discovered. The green lines represent the recuperation phase of the biosphere after a crustal deformation. If the crust deforms due to high eccentric orbit, there were enormous climatic changes of the biosphere. Some regions were moved to areas where it was colder and other regions to areas to where it is warmer. But the whole biosphere was gone upside down, and that process of deformation needs recuperation. And you see this recuperation phase as green lines. And from the left to the right, pole 6, green line, pole 5, green line upwards, pole 4, line upwards, pole 3, pole 2, and today we are at pole 1. So the temperature will still rise. And that rise of temperature is not depending of CO2. I repeat, the rise of temperature is not depending of CO2. And why is temperature not depending of CO2? Because CO2 lags on this temperature graph. And this lag of CO2 is about 1,000 years. So CO2 responds to the crustal deformations. We now go to today, and let's try to answer the question, how much will the temperature rise? Still rise, no matter what humans do. Destroying forests is bad for the climate. It's very simple. Near cities, temperatures are always higher than temperatures near forests. Forests are a natural cooling system, and destroying forests is the most stupid things people can do, really. It only catalyzes this process of global warming, and that is simple truth. But if humans would stop flying airplanes, stop driving cars, stop cutting forests, the temperature will still go up. If there were no humans around, the temperature would still go up. Because we are now in a cycle of a recuperation of the biosphere. Between 130,000 years ago, after the stable position of pole 2, the crust began to deform over a long period of time, between 130,000 years and about 30,000 years ago. Over a period of 100,000 years, the crust was in turmoil. That is the reason why ancient cultures were warped into a new Stone Age, because this period is so very long. It is not just a decade of storms and hurricanes and volcanoes and tsunamis and terrible earthquakes. Not just a decade of these natural disasters, but 100,000 years of non-stop enormous catastrophes. That is what happened, and that is why humanity was warped into a new Stone Age. Back to the question, how much will our climate still warm? And that is a statistical analysis. About 400,000 years ago, it peaked at around 2.6 degrees, plus 2.6 degrees. Then, around 340,000 years ago, that is the second peak from the left, it peaked at very high at around 4.9 degrees. And these are now absolute temperatures. They are relative temperatures relative to each other, because they are recalculated from the ice core from Antarctica. Then a third peak, that is the last stable period of pole 4, the pole of Stonehenge, for example. It peaked at plus 2.7 degrees. During the position of pole 4, the biosphere was not entirely recuperated before the next crustal deformation began. We see this not entirely recuperation of the biosphere to at around 5 degrees, but it stopped, and so it dived back down again. So the crust began to deform, and we went after around 20,000 years, again in a stable period. We see this as pole 3. And pole 3 had also not the possibility to recuperate completely because of a very high eccentric orbit, and the crust started to deform again. And you see this wild ride to pole 2. After this wild ride from pole 3 to pole 2, the crust recuperated again at plus 5.5 degrees. Then again a wild ride to our current pole. The biosphere is already recuperating for almost 30,000 years. So we are still in the recuperation phase of our biosphere, and as humans we look at the temperatures and we measure the temperatures. While we don't seem to understand why it is going up because the biosphere is recuperating. Can we predict how much the temperature will rise over the next millennia? The next wild ride of the crust will not start within a few years. It will still take many, many centuries before this process starts. But there is something catastrophic waiting for humanity, and that is an enormous temperature rise that cannot be stopped. It will still rise with approximately 2 degrees. And some of you might say 2 degrees is not so much. 2 degrees is catastrophic for the poles, especially the North Pole and Greenland. Greenland will definitely melt during this process of recuperation, because Greenland was moved over the North Pole during the crustal deformation processes, and because Greenland was moved over the North Pole, it started to accumulate an ice sheet, a massive ice sheet, and this ice sheet is now moved again just a little bit outside, a little bit inside the Arctic zone. But Greenland is not at a position where it can maintain its ice sheet, because this ice sheet was formed on the North Pole, on the geographic North Pole, the spin axis. So this rise in temperature will have a catastrophic effect on Greenland, because if the biosphere still warms up, it will warm up the equator, the tropic region, and because this tropic region is much larger than the polar regions, this energy will be transported to the poles by the Gulf streams. These Gulf streams transport energy from warm regions to cold regions. And this is the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics states energy will be transported from warm to cold, from high energy to low energy. There is low energy at the poles, that is why they are in ice, and the hot regions, these tropic regions, will transport their energy to cold regions, the pole regions. This is a simple, basic law, and it will never change. A law of the universe. Energy goes from high to low. This is a simple explanation of the second law of thermodynamics. But it applies also to our planet. It applies to our biosphere. It applies to the whole system of how energy is transported around our planet. And we live on this planet together, and we need to understand what is happening with our planet. Humans will simply disappear if they go on like this. Will simply disappear from the planet and will be replaced by another species that will do it maybe better, maybe worse. Just evolution will continue. So humanity is just think they are so great that they can destroy the planet. They have no influence on this process of global warming. Global warming already started more than 20,000 years ago, and it is still going on. These are very long processes of a big, big planet. And this big planet responds very slowly to massive disruptions. And this is what still takes place today. This is just a short video on this very interesting topic. If you like the video, please give me a thumb up, and you can also leave a comment below. And you can also visit my Patreon page and become my patron to support our work. I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye bye.